All right, we're going to start our last session of the conference, our actual last session of the conference. We're running way behind, and so I am happy to cut introductions quite a bit to absorb some of that, so forgive the brief introductions. We are lucky to have Rebecca Hamilton here from the University of Maryland, although soon to be perhaps from another university. Rebecca received her PhD in 2000, same year I received mine, from MIT Sloan, and she's been at Maryland, I think, pretty much ever since. But now she's decided it may be time for a change. She studies decision-making, as do all three of our speakers in this session, so you'll get quite a different flavor in the second half where you'll see more experimental psychology-type work and less analytical stuff. So if you've had too much math in the morning, rest assured there's less ahead of you than behind you. So without further ado, Rebecca.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I'm going to be building on one of the themes from several of our earlier presentations, that the context influences consumers. So in Pedro's discussion, he talked about how consumers are influenced by others they observe on an airline. We learned yesterday from Marlene Towns that when consumers contribute discussion to online forums, they are influenced by where they are. Right? So if they're thinking about contributing something negative, they feel it's more appropriate for Twitter, whereas if they're going to be contributing positive content, they're more likely to think of Facebook. Right? So in this project, we're similarly going to be looking at social context and how it influences consumers. I'm working with co-authors Anne Schlosser from the University of Washington and Yuzhen Chen, who's at Lingnan University. And we are going to be looking at online discussion forums as one of those contexts. So when I first started working with Anne, she invited me to the University of Washington to give a talk so we could get started on the project. And we started by looking at some data from online discussion forums. We went to TripAdvisor. Because we were in Seattle, we looked at some posts for Seattle hotels. So we looked at this one, which was posted by Boydog, and he is asking which of two different Seattle hotels he should stay in during an upcoming trip. Right. So he's asking, should I stay at the Silver Cloud or the Red Lion? And then we looked at the responses that came forward from other people. Right? The first response was from David GMG, who is a destination expert for Seattle, and he talks about having stayed at the Red Lion multiple times. It's right in the heart of everything you want to see and do, so it has a great location. I think there's no comparison. You should book the Red Lion. What we found very interesting is that the second respondent doesn't claim to have any expertise, in fact hasn't stayed at either hotel, has posted lots and lots of times, 22,000 times, and essentially repeats the same information that David GMG had already provided, right? She's also focusing on location. So what is the purpose of this post? Why is Susie to you providing this information that doesn't seem to be all that helpful to the person who posted the question, right? What has confused researchers in online and word of mouth for a long time is, why do people post responses to queries like this, right? We can see it's fairly obvious why the first person, Boydog, would request information from other people. He wants to find out which of the two hotels is going to be the best for an upcoming trip, right? That's a very rational reason for requesting information. But the two responses that come forward, it's less clear why they're contributing their time and energy to provide information. And some earlier research in this area has looked at the different goals that consumers have for providing these kinds of responses. Maybe it is altruism. Maybe they want to make the world a better place by making sure everyone stays in the right kind of hotel, right? And thus their goal is to be very accurate. But it could also be things like self-enhancement. They want to build their own reputation, perhaps as a destination expert for Seattle, and they might get some value out of providing that reputation online. Or they might be really mad at one of the hotels or other service providers and get their anger out by posting a very negative commentary. right? Or it could be that they're affiliating with other people and they get some value out of establishing common ground with people who might share opinions or be interested in similar topics. So clearly, what we find interesting is that many of these goals conflict with that goal of eliciting accurate information. So the person who asked the question, Boy Dog, wanted information about, which should I choose, hotel A or B. If people are hoping to establish their own reputation or they're trying to affiliate with others, those aren't necessarily going to be consistent with the questioner's request for information. Right? So that's what we're going to be looking at in this project. One of the reasons that we chose online discussion forums instead of reviews, which are more frequent, is that online discussion forums give us an environment that we can see whether there's a right answer to the question, right? So for reviews, the audience is somewhat ambiguous. You're posting a review on Amazon.com or on TripAdvisor. Who's going to read that? It's not necessarily clear. But for an online discussion forum, the questioner is your audience, right? So if you're posting a response, you know that a person has asked for specific information, often providing explicit criteria about how they're going to make the decision. So it's fairly clear whether they're getting that kind of good information from the query. Okay, so we can evaluate the quality of the responses more objectively than we can looking at a series of reviews. So when we think of these online discussion forums as a conversation among people, what happens is that there are certain rules that should guide the exchange of information. When we talk to someone here at the conference, we expect that if we talk about something with them, they'll follow certain rules of the communication game. They will be clear in the words they use to talk with us so that we understand their response. They're not going to use words we don't understand. They're going to be truthful. They aren't going to provide misinformation deliberately to us. What they're going to tell us is hopefully relevant. So if I'm asking about hotels in Seattle, a response that talks about hotels in Milwaukee is clearly not relevant, and we wouldn't expect that kind of information. We also expect to get the appropriate quantity of information. So if I've asked a question and I'm in a discussion with two people, one answers my question, the other person doesn't need to provide the same information again. So the norm of quantity suggests that once information's been provided, no need to repeat yourself. Right? So it's interesting that in these two responses to Boy Dog's question, one of them seemed to be repeating that kind of information back to the question. We're going to be looking in this research at these two competing explanations for what's going on. Right? One thing that might be happening is that the advice seeker is going to drive all the responses by putting in place certain criteria that are relevant. Right? So the advice seeker really should have a lot of influence on the responses. If the advice seeker says location is the most important thing or price is the most important thing, any responses should reflect those criteria. On the other hand, another thing that might be going on is that there's some effect of the social context where the respondents might be wanting to affiliate with one another, and then there might be a reason to repeat information that's already been shared. We know in offline context there's an effect of people wanting to share information. In fact, in many group discussion contexts, research has shown that people are more likely to repeat shared information and not elicit and contribute to the discussion unshared information. Right? They're also going to evaluate people more positively when they repeat shared information than when they provide new information. Right? So that clearly goes against the goals of the advice seeker, right, in getting the most information possible. So what we did to start is look at real discussion forums, like the one I showed you on TripAdvisor. So we chose two discussion forums on TripAdvisor, one for Seattle hotels and one for Washington, D.C. restaurants. And we also chose a third forum just to make sure we weren't getting a TripAdvisor effect, looking at a Disney discussion board for hotels in Orlando. So we had a few different cities. We had a few different product categories or service categories. And then we looked at 300 224 different posts from 85 threads. And when we looked and then we coded the attributes that people talked about to get a sense of the content that was in the advice seeker's initial post and the content that was in each of the subsequent responses. And so one of the things that we think makes this research unique is that we did such a painstaking job of coding all of this data. So text analysis has become more and more common, but we felt that we weren't going to be getting all the information we needed from a simple text analysis that was automated. We really needed human coders to do this. So we had a few people code each of the different posts, and overall we had more than 4,000 different attributes in all of these different discussion threads and posts. So what we found when we looked at this, we used a repeated measures logistic regression, where the discussion thread was the unit of analysis and the attributes that were mentioned were the repeated measures. And what we found for the first response is exactly what we'd expect based on conversational norms. When the advice seeker posts a question, the attributes that are mentioned, right, are more likely to be mentioned by the first respondent. Right? Very rational. So if the advice seeker asks about location, the first response also talks about location. Right? So exactly what we'd expect. Things get a little more interesting when we look at the second response. Right? So the second response is more likely to mention the same attributes as the first response, even controlling for what the advice seeker has asked about. So we're getting sort of a multiple effects here, and we're finding that people are repeating information that's already been shared in the discussion. Right? So this is less helpful for the advice seeker, clearly. They're just repeating shared information. And then when we looked at the third response, we again see this effect where the third person is influenced by what the second person mentions and what the first person mentions above and beyond what the advice seeker had asked about. Right? And this ripples down the line. So clearly, we're not getting all the information that we could from the discussion. Right? This is capturing a social effect, and so we wanted to know a little bit more about what was going on. Right? There's some limitations with looking at real data because the number of responses varies, the structure varies, and so it's not very clean data. Please.
I've been trying to understand this notion of conversational norms that we're using as a basis of hypothesis. And so the thing is, in an online discussion forum, right, we don't see each other, right? So if you ask me a question and I give you an answer, and Chuck is right here next to me, and if he disagrees, he will say, I disagree, but if he agrees with me, he's not going to say anything. That would be a conversational norm. But in a discussion forum, if I tell you a piece of information that you are not sure and the rest of nobody knows is completely true, there is some value in him chiming in and saying, yeah, that's exactly right.
Yes, so there could be a reinforcing effect. Agree. What we're going to do in some of our follow-up experiments is design a situation where some information is more relevant and other information is less relevant. If we see the same effect where people repeat irrelevant information, that's more of a confirmation that this norm of quantity is being violated. Right? If they repeat relevant, important information, it could be more of a reinforcing effect. Yes. Yes, so that's one area where this real analysis of discussion forum data is not going to tell us all the information we need. Yes. So we're going to hold a lot of these factors constant in a lab study. And we took advantage of an event that happens on campus at the University of Maryland. This was a little bit over a year ago. We just had a more recent Maryland Day. But it's a day when people from across the community come in and learn about the University of Maryland. And so we, shortly before this Maryland Day event happened, conducted a study where we asked students and alumni of the University of Maryland to respond to a query that we created asking about 2 different areas to park while visiting campus. And we asked, so we had a query, and then and this person asked about where to park, lot 1 or lot 2, and we told them a bit about this person's agenda, and then we had 2 different responses that we gave them, which supposedly were the first response to this query. So in the first, we emphasized the crowds that were going to be at this event. And in the second, which was identical except for a few changes in the information, they emphasized the closeness between the events they wanted to see and the parking garage. So they were either talking about closeness or they were talking about crowdedness. We expected this to influence the response of the person that came next, as well as potentially their recommendations about which of the parking lots to choose. And we found that's exactly what happened. So if the first response talked about how close the parking area was to the events, that's what was reflected in the second response. If the first person said that this was all about crowdedness, that's what we got in the second response. Right? And again, this could be a metric of importance, but when we asked people about which of these two attributes was more important, more people said that closeness was important than crowdedness. I guess there's an assumption this kind of event is going to be crowded on campus, right? Get over it. So the closeness was much more important, and yet we see this same effect. If people talk about crowdedness, then that's what happens, and they actually were more likely to recommend the less crowded lot when they were thinking much more about crowdedness, right? So we see this effect on the recommendations as well. What we see is that the posted content, as well as the recommendations, are influenced. Now we get into this issue more clearly of what's relevant and what's less relevant for making the decision. And we're going to test in our next study whether a very critical attribute is ignored by people if they're following the lead of someone who posts before them. So in this case, we even increase the control, right? So in our study about Maryland Day, we increased the control because we provided the first response and the query. In this case, we're going to ask some people about something that's unfamiliar to them and ask them to post a response using information we give them. So we're controlling for familiarity, which could have potentially varied among some of the participants in our last study. We had University of Washington students provide a response about restaurants in Boston. We gave them all the information they needed about restaurants in Boston, told them that someone else had been doing some research and shared it with them so that they had this information. And then they were going to provide either the first response to the query, the second response, or the third response. And the responses prior to theirs either mentioned a critical attribute, which was whether the restaurant was suitable for a group, or another attribute, which was atmosphere. And so the post mentioned that this was going to be a usage experience involving a large group of people, 7 diners in total. The person said that they were going to Boston to meet up with some friends from college. So this was a very important attribute. In fact, one of the restaurants was described as being very well suited for groups. The other restaurant was not, and you couldn't very easily get a table for over 6 people. Right? So kind of an important thing to elicit. What we found is that when there was no response, when this was just a response to the advice seeker, we found that more people talked about the critical attribute of being suitable for a group than the less critical attribute of atmosphere. Right? Just as we'd expect. This is perfectly rational. This is all about the norms of conversation taking place. On the other hand, when the first response talked about the suitability for group, right? So we see the same thing when the first response talked about suitability for group, right? Here, it could be the social context. It could be just what they do without any response before theirs. But when the first response talked about atmosphere, this less important attribute first, then they took the cue and talked about atmosphere rather than group suitability, right? So this is where the response is not one that's likely to be reinforcing an important point, and it's not providing information that's very much needed and desired by the advice seeker. Our lab data is essentially telling us a lot about this, right? Because we're suggesting again that previous responses affect the respondents. we wanted to understand a little bit more about the mechanism, right? Is it because the first person is perceived to be more expert, right? And I'm maybe learning from the discussion about my own preferences and recommendations? Or is it this affiliation explanation that we've suggested where you want to establish common ground with some of the respondents who've come before you? Right, so we ran a couple more studies to try to understand this. So in the next study, we had Maryland students do the same, essentially the same study, looking at Boston restaurants and making recommendations about these for a group dinner. We varied whether the first response was attributed to an expert or a novice. So the first response claimed to have been to both of these restaurants many times, making him an expert, or to have never been to these establishments and just hearsay evidence was being provided. Right? So that's expert versus novice. And then again, we discussed the critical attribute of being suitable for a group or the less critical attribute of atmosphere. And what we found is that the expert versus novice manipulation was not having any effect. Right? So it wasn't that people were listening more to experts and following the lead of experts more than novices. In fact, we see about the same thing. So this helped us rule out the explanation of more of an informational influence where we're learning from the person who comes before us. And so we thought we'd spend more time thinking about the affiliation explanation. Right? For this, we ran a study where we asked people to post for a reason. We gave them a goal. Right? Either your goal is to provide accurate information to the advice seeker, as we'd hope that was happening, or their goal was to interact with the other participants in the discussion forum. And again, we manipulated the mention of atmosphere, the less critical attribute, or group suitability. And what we found here is that the accuracy goal really took away this effect. When people were trying to be accurate, they mentioned the attribute of being suitable for a group. They also mentioned atmosphere, but they did get out the mention of group suitability. It was more when they were trying to affiliate with others that we really see these irrelevant mentions of atmosphere that aren't very helpful to the discussion, and the lack of mention of group suitability, which is the critical deal breaker for the advice seeker. So this suggests that it's driven more by normative influence than by informational influence because the group goal condition replicates our earlier effect, and when we tell people try to be really accurate, it takes away the effect. So it's interesting to consider, why do consumers care so much about these people they don't even know, right? It's easy to understand why you might be influenced by people if you're talking in a group of people you know, but why do we display this mimicry when we're talking with others online? Right? It's not a very rich social context. We can also think about implications for platform design. If the creators of a platform want to provide the most accurate information for advice seekers, it's reasonable that they might take away the ability to see previous responses because they seem to be influencing the discussion quite heavily. If everyone is the first respondent, right, they're going to provide the information that is relevant to the advice seeker, as we saw in our control condition when people didn't have a previous response to reflect on. That might be a way to get more accurate information. What we don't know is how much people are motivated by these affiliation goals to participate at all. Right? So we said at the beginning there's this puzzle about why people bother to respond to these queries. Why do they bother to take their own time and energy to provide a response? Well, it's because potentially they get this value from affiliation. If we take that away by eliminating these prior responses, we might drive down response rates and make the forum less valuable. So, it's an important decision whether to, how to structure these forums to make sure that all these goals are being met. You can also think about segmentation. Do you want people who are very very similar to one another to be on the same forum? Should this be a product-specific forum, or should it be a more category-specific forum?